I go, I'm putting on. Putting on, putting on. Everywhere I go, I'm putting on. Putting on, putting on. Everywhere I go, I'm putting on. Putting on. Where you from?
Welcome to Popcorn Sports on the Popcorn Entertainment Network. I'm your host, Mike Kyle, and today we are picking up where we left off with our why you should root for every team in the NBA in the 2018-2019 season. I, of course, am not alone. As we preview the Detroit Pistons, I am joined here by Lazarus Jackson of the Detroit Bad Boys. You can follow him on Twitter at LazChance, and he's also the host of the Detroit Bad Boys podcast. Laz, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hey, Mike. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. You kind of hit everything between the Twitter and the podcast. I would say the only thing left for people to do is to read whenever I write anything at DetroitBadBoys.com, which is the SB Nation Pistons fan site.
Absolutely. Go ahead. I will leave all the links to everything in the description down below. So my first question for you, and the question that I ask all of my guests who come on, is how did you become a fan of the Pistons?
So I'm from Metro Detroit. I'm from Redford, which is just north of Dearborn and just west of Detroit. And so I grew up loving basketball at a young age, but I came of age during the going to work years, the 04 Pistons when they won the championship over the Lakers. That was a really big formative moment in my adolescence. And so ever since then, or even before then, but ever since then, that kind of sealed it. And so I've been a Pistons fan for, 16 years now, something like that.
Okay.
It's crazy to think about, but yeah.
Yeah, that is crazy. And I mean, especially for me, growing up in that era, that was when I was first getting into basketball. And that was when the Pistons and the Cavs had that rivalry. You're looking at the late 2000s, 2008 and 2007, things like that. And so, I mean, I just remember growing up, and it's like you're looking for the primetime matchups versus the Pistons with Chauncey, Rip, Sheed, and Ben. And, and Tayshaun even too. So, I also have a little bit of some history with the Pistons from that era as well. What do you remember from that era, just specifically? What stands out to you?
The thing that I always remember was the way that Chauncey Billups, controlled the pace and tempo of a game. He was just the penultimate point guard for that team. So good defensively, so clutch. Was able to distribute and score, just kept teams off balance all the time, kept everything running smoothly. So I really loved watching Chauncey play.
So is Chauncey your guy then?
Yeah, Chauncey was my guy.
All right, Rip was my guy, so I understand it. All right, so let's kind of shift gears now. Let's just talk a general overview of the Pistons. They joined the NBA in 1948. They were one of the first teams in the NBA. And the Pistons, from a team name perspective, references Detroit's automobile industry. Their team colors are red, white, and blue if you're into that kind of thing, to choose your team that you root for. They have 41 playoff appearances, 3 NBA championships, one of them which you already mentioned, and they play in the Central Division with the Cavs, the Bucks, the Pacers, and the Bulls. Do you, obviously we just kind of talked about it a little bit, but what do you remember from that championship run?
So the thing I really remember was the way that ESPN and the national media talked about the Lakers as if the Pistons had no chance.
Right.
That was the end of the Kobe and Shaq three-peat. They were going for 4. That was the year they had picked up Gary Payton and Karl Malone, 2 Hall of Famers. They were it's a squad of 4 Hall of Famers. There's no way this ragtag Pistons group has any shot. And then it was really just it wasn't even a contest, but it wasn't even a contest for the Pistons. They needed some heroics from Kobe, I think, in Game 2, if I remember correctly, to even to avoid the sweep. And so, that was just getting to shove that, I think, in the faces of everyone everywhere is just really, really memorable. Aside from what I've already talked about.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And, the Lakers, especially during that time, they were the powerhouse, and that's still something that I feel kind of rings true in the aspect of, especially with Detroit, where obviously since you're from there, you get the whole mentality, the whole underdog, let's grind this out, and let's show people.
Yeah,
exactly. Right. So that's really, really awesome. So now let's kind of focus towards last season, because that was really interesting from an outsider's perspective. So I'm hoping you can give me some insight here. So they finished outside of the playoffs. They went 39-43. And they traded for Blake Griffin in the middle of the year, and then obviously, since they missed the playoffs, they fired Stan Van Gundy, brought in Dwayne Casey, former coach of the Raptors, who just won Coach of the Year. So what can you make of the last season for me?
So last season was just like really a roller coaster for the Pistons. They started 14-6 in their first 20 games, and like you say, after your first 20 games, you kind of are who you are. It did not end up being the case for them. They lost, I think, their next 7 games in a row to drop all the way to like 14-13. And then a couple games after that, they lost their starting point guard, Reggie Jackson, to an injury that kept him out for the better part of like 2.5 months. And so after they lost Reggie Jackson, they went 3-11 in the month of January. They just couldn't score at all. And not being able to score really like put a emphasis on defense that the team just like didn't really take to mentally. So they went 3-11 in January. Blake trade happens at the end of February, if I'm remembering correctly. And then after the Blake Griffin trade, they win their first 5 games. Everybody thinks it's going to be a playoff push, but the first 5 games were all home games against teams on the second half of a back-to-back. So pretty much like games you'd expect to win, like regardless of whether or not you make the Blake trade or not. After that, it was kind of tough, rough and tumble for a couple games. They lost a really big back-to-back against Orlando and Miami on a weekend. That pretty much they really needed the Miami game. They were fighting with Miami for like the 7th seed at that point. They really needed both of those games, but they needed the tiebreaker over Miami especially, and they didn't. And they lost both of those games, so that was obviously out of the question. Reggie Jackson came back a little bit too late. He came back like just in time for a West Coast swing in which they played like Phoenix and Sacramento, and so he had some time to get his bearings. But by then, they were like pretty much mathematically eliminated. Blake Griffin sat like the last 5 games of the year because they didn't need him. So it was really just they had like these highs and these lows, and the season just kind of went all over the place for the Pistons last year. I don't envy any Pistons fans for wanting a little bit more stability this season coming up.
Absolutely. And, going back to the whole Blake trade, that was very out of the blue, I would say. I mean, it just all of a sudden check your phone and it's like Blake Griffin just got traded. And he got traded to Detroit of all places, which isn't a bad thing. But you know what I mean? It was very I don't know the proper way to describe it, but it was just a very interesting move by the Pistons to bring in a guy like Blake Griffin when you have Andre Drummond playing the 5 and the 4 there. What was just the reaction of bringing in a guy like Blake Griffin? What do you think he can do for your team moving forward?
So the initial reaction on DVD and elsewhere was that like this was the last gasp of like Stan Van Gundy trying to make the playoffs and save his job and everything. And then, as we got more information, as some of the beat reporters that worked for the local papers kind of dug into things and talked to the front office, like this was something that the ownership wanted. This was something that the whole front office as an organization was on board with. And so it makes a little bit more sense in that retrospect. The Pistons recently moved downtown into a brand new arena.
Right.
That arena had been like maybe 45% full some nights, and it wasn't a good look for the team to not be able to sell tickets. And so like adding a star like that in Blake Griffin, I think was what appealed to ownership. Now, as for Blake and Andre's fit, I think, like on the court, I think they fit better than people envision them to be. People still imagine that, or they still think of Blake as like this nuclear athlete who's dunking over people, and that's not the player he is anymore. But what the player he is now, though, is like a really effective low post player, a player who's a really good passer out of the high post, and a guy who started to hit threes. He shot 35% from 3 in his time in Detroit, and looked comfortable doing so. It didn't look like he wasn't insanely hot. If I remember correctly, actually, he started his like first 5 games with the Pistons like something like 0 of 13 or like 0 of 14 from 3. And so like there was room for his numbers to grow even. And so I'm really excited about what the Pistons look like with a full season of Blake Griffin and Andre Drummond together.
And with that, I think that's a really good segue into the roster. And obviously, as we just mentioned, you have Drummond and Griffin, Reggie Jackson, Stanley Johnson, Luke Kennard, second-year player out of Duke, Glenn Robinson. They brought in Pachulia and Jose Calderon as well. Just what do you make of this roster that stands right now?
So the thing that concerns me about the roster is that it appears that, I don't know if they couldn't or they didn't find anybody that they liked, but the thing that sunk the Pistons the last 2 years were injuries to Reggie Jackson.
Right.
That stretched Ish Smith into a starting role where he is adequate to below adequate, and furthermore, it brought up a rotating cast of characters at third string point guard. Beno Udre was a third string point guard. Dwight Bikes last year, they signed Langston Galloway to allegedly take care of some of that, and then that turned out to not be the case. And so this year they brought in Jose Calderon, but I don't know if Jose Calderon has anything left in the tank. And so I think roster-wise, if we incur another injury to Reggie Jackson, I'm not sure how well insured the Pistons are for that. Aside from that, though, the other big hole I think is backup power forward, where they're relying on John Lure and Henry Ellenson, I think, to cover those spots. And so if you end up in a situation where Blake Griffin, suffers another injury, not a devastating injury, but a minor ankle tweak or something, you'll end up in a position where the Pistons are going to start John Lure or start Henry Ellenson. And the talent gap between those two players, between Blake and Henry Ellenson, is so great that you wonder how they'll be able to adjust on both ends of the court. And so I think that's the most concerning thing for me about the roster is the lack of depth behind Reggie Jackson and Blake Griffin.
What do you think the impact of Reggie Jackson is for this team?
So I think, honestly, the thing with Reggie is that he has really good pick and roll chemistry with Andre. That was apparent the instant they traded for him, almost 3 years ago now.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is that Ish Smith he's a good player, but he is a limited player. Last year was the first time he really started taking threes, and he did an okay job of making them. But prior to that, the defenses didn't even respect him if he didn't have the ball in his hands, and he's at his most effective in transition, attacking other bench units. And when he's playing with the starters, they play a little bit more half-court orientated, and that's not really his strength. And so, Reggie being injured kind of forces Ish to play in a way that's not conducive to, his strength. And then, like I said, it forces guys like Dwight Bikes and guys like Beno Udre to step up their games to a point where they're not, they're elevated, perhaps, their capabilities. And so I really just think it's not so much that, Reggie Jackson is such a key part. It's that the backups behind him are just not really suited to long-term success in the NBA, which is that's kind of fair. You can say that about a lot of teams that, if they lost their starting point guard, they'd be in a lot of trouble.
Right, and I agree. I personally really like Reggie Jackson. I think he just provides a lot on offense, and I think he's just a very, very good floor general. I think he just runs an offense really well. Maybe one player that you are most excited to watch this upcoming season, who's maybe a breakout player or a guy you're just really looking forward to watching?
So I'm really, really, really excited, and if you follow me on Twitter, you know what I'm about to say. I'm really excited about Glenn Robinson III.
Okay.
There's a free agent signing from the Pistons this offseason. He was a guy who was going to come into Indiana last year and kind of fight for a starting wing spot. He suffered this really bad ankle injury in training camp. And then after that, he kind of never found a place on the roster. By the time he was ready to return, Indiana was a secure playoff team. They wanted to kind of keep their rotation and keep their chemistry. And so he couldn't, he was kind of a man without a home. In Detroit, he's a guy who can finish plays. He shot 47% from corner threes in the last 2 years, which is something the Pistons have desperately needed, is shooting ability from their wings. He's an athletic guy. I think he can contribute on the offensive boards and on defense. I think he'll be an adequate on-ball defender. He's got the size and strength, I think, to check a lot of the larger wings in the Eastern Conference. And so, I think Glenn Robinson III should start over Stanley Johnson. And I've been kind of we've been going back and forth about that in Pistons Twitter, in Pistons fandom. But I'm really high on Glenn Robinson III. I think he's going to have a breakout year for Detroit.
All right, and with that, we're going to take a quick break. I'll reset everything, and then we'll jump back into it.
All right.
Cool. Good stuff, good stuff. There was one thing I was just going to ask you, and we can hang on. Do you just think that Glenn Robinson can just do just so many different things for the Pistons?
So the thing is, they don't really need him to, right?
Right.
Like they need him to make open shots and defend pretty well and get some rebounds and don't try and do too much. And I think he can definitely adequately do those things. Versus Stanley Johnson isn't the spot up shooter he is. He's not he's a better defender and he's maybe a more creative passer. But Stanley's opportunities to do those things are kind of limited when he's playing next to Blake, when he's playing next to Reggie, even when he's playing next to Andre. The way that we talked about it on the blog was that, somebody has to be the fifth starter. And Stanley Johnson looks like his best role is not as the fifth starter. It's as a guy with the ball in his hands. But with the starting lineup as currently constructed, they need a guy who can just shoot threes and defend. And Glenn Robinson III can do that.
Yeah, I got you. All right, so let's shift gears now over to the fandom side of things and all the fun that is Pistons Twitter. There are, I'm sure, a lot of dynamics like there are with a lot of fandom Twitters. What are your favorite parts about Pistons Twitter?
So I think my favorite thing about Pistons Twitter is that we all have our little different specialities.
Okay.
Some guys are they're more on the humorous side. I prefer to be a little bit more analytical. There's a couple guys who are really into advanced stats, and we have a couple guys who cut up clips. And so I think if you're following everyone, and I have a Twitter list. If you're following everyone, you get a really comprehensive look at the Detroit Pistons, which I think is something that you can't really say for every team in the NBA. And I also think that if you're not on Twitter, you might be missing out on that somewhat. I don't live in Michigan anymore, but when I lived in Michigan and the Pistons weren't good, the media coverage, the sports radio talk, the TV time dedicated to the Pistons was really meager. And so that's part of the reason why I'm on the blog, is to give people who like the Pistons the quality analysis that they deserve and that they won't get from their local media.
Yeah, I got you. And I think that's a very interesting point that nobody else has made, at least that I've talked to, where you kind of have just a comprehensive just fold of different aspects of basketball at this moment of time. You said you have the humorous side, you have the analytics, and it all just kind of gels really nicely, it sounds like, at least from the outside looking in. What have been some of your favorite parts or moments of Pistons Twitter so far?
So I think the game winner Marcus Morris hit over his brother 2 years ago, that was a lot of fun. Seeing everyone kind of react to the Blake Griffin trade in real time and us bouncing stuff off of each other, that was a really interesting night. Excuse me. Sorry.
No worries.
Stan Van Gundy being hired and subsequently fired, I think was a really interesting time to be a part of Pistons Twitter. There was so much optimism surrounding Stan Van Gundy when he was first hired, and then when he was let go kind of after a lot of other NBA head coaches had already been let go, and the front office executives had been let go. And so there was a lot of concern that oh no, the Pistons have they fired their guy too late, and now whoever they're going to replace him with isn't going to be as good. Fortunately, the front office and the ownership came together, and we ended up with Dwayne Casey.
Right.
But no one thought that was a possibility at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so things like that, shared experiences, I think bring us closer together.
What can you say about Pistons fans as a whole? Obviously, because you have your bad boys in the 80s, as you mentioned already, the era in the early 2000s, and then you have your group of Pistons fans right now. What do you think, what are the dynamics between the intersection of each one of those cultures?
So Pistons fans are really interesting because people from Detroit and people who love the Pistons are really knowledgeable about the game of basketball.
Okay.
But I think that there is a higher level of expectation than other fan bases because of the success that the Pistons have had in the past. That's not to say like fans can't want their team to be a championship contender. They absolutely should. But you have to remember, like, the Bad Boys, like, no one expected the Bad Boys to beat, like, Michael Jordan and the Bulls and Larry Bird and the Celtics and Magic Johnson and the Lakers, even, like, Hakeem Olajuwon and, like, the Rockets. Like, no one really expected the Bad Boys to be back-to-back champions. No one expected that, like we talked about earlier, no one really expected the 04 Pistons to win their championships. And so there's this, like, running strain of disrespect for one of the more storied fan bases and organizations like in the league that kind of runs through Pistons fandom. And so there's always a sense that, like, you know, no one believes in us ever. Like, why can't we, like, we should just be able to show them, like, we should be more successful than we are, just, like, show people that, like, you know, we're not LA, we're not Miami, we're not New York or whatever, but, like, we're Detroit and we're still successful. And so there's a lot of expectations kind of surrounding that have not been fulfilled by the current organization, and I think that's the source of a lot of frustration among Pistons fans who, you know, just really want to see a playoff contender. I think they've earned it, but I also have questions. You know, I think a lot of times Pistons fans aren't really looking around like the whole of the league. They're just kind of expecting to do their own thing and be successful. But like when you look at the talent that's like across the league, it makes sense that the Pistons are where they are, unfortunately.
Do you think that they're on the right track, though?
I do. I think the Blake Griffin trade was definitely like a huge step in that regard. It's really difficult to win in the NBA without star talent, and Blake Griffin is unquestionably the best player the Pistons have had in like the better part of a decade.
Right. I completely agree with that as well. So with that, we'll get you out of here on this. You have 30 seconds to pitch anybody who isn't already a fan of the Pistons why they should be. Go ahead. The floor is yours.
All right, so we got Blake Griffin, we've got Andre Drummond, we've got a brand spanking new arena, we've got a amazing broadcast duo in Greg Kelser and George Blaha, we've got like classic looking uniforms, we've got, if you don't want to cheer for like a team that's, if you don't want to cheer for like the basketball equivalent of the Yankees or whatever, like the Detroit Pistons have a good blend of like underdogness and like past success that you can attach yourself to.
I like that.
Yeah, I think that makes a difference for a lot of teams. Like, if you want to be a bandwagon fan, like, that's fine, but, like, everybody just likes the bandwagon fan of, like, the Cowboys or the Yankees, right? Like, don't be, like, a bandwagon Lakers fan. Like, pick a different team, and, like, Detroit is, like, really good for that.
I hear you. I really like those reasons that you gave me as well. Be sure to check out the Pistons on League Pass this year. And this has been myself, Mike Kyle, and Lazarus Jackson. You can follow him on Twitter at LazChance. He's the editor of DetroitBadBoys.com. He's also the host of the Detroit Bad Boys podcast. Do you have any other messages or final thoughts that you want to send out right now?
No, man. Thanks so much for having me, Mike. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. No problem. I will leave the links to all of his information in the description down below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. All down below. We greatly appreciate it. And with that, we will catch you guys next time. All right, we're good. Thank you all so much for checking out today's video. If you are new here, click the video right above my head. It's going to give you all the details about the Popcorn Entertainment Network. If you want to see the latest video from this series, click the upper left-hand corner and be sure to check all the boxes down to the left of me. That includes subscribing, get your butt in the bucket. We'd love to have you as part of our community. Hit that like button, share it with a friend, interact with us down below in the comments section, and last but not least, check out our website, popcornent.com, where we post all new and exclusive content. And lastly, be sure to follow us on all of our social media at popcornentnet on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And with that, we'll see you next time.